Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into over 4 centuries of American history. We're setting out to discover exactly how the United States was forged in the constant and honestly often intense friction of conflict and compromise. It's a massive story, full of incredible ambition, devastating costs, and monumental transformations. So, we're going to break this massive timeline down into 6 chronological chapters. We've got Worlds Collide, The Road to Revolution, Forging a New Nation, Manifest Destiny and Expansion, A House Divided, and finally, Reconstruction and the West. We'll start with the very first European contacts and journey all the way through to the close of the Reconstruction era. There's a lot of ground to cover, so let's jump right in.
Chapter 1. Worlds Collide, The Foundations of a New World. Our explainer kicks off with a vast, incredibly resource-rich continent. Now, you already know this land was populated by complex, highly sophisticated native societies long before any European sails showed up on the horizon. Thousands of years of history were already in place.
But things transformed at a breakneck pace once contact was made. Moving from Columbus's arrival in 1492, we quickly see the establishment of permanent and, frankly, incredibly brutal foundations. We go from the first surviving English colony at Jamestown in 1607 to the Puritans arriving in 1620 and, darkly, the 1619 arrival of the first enslaved Africans in Virginia. That moment right there kicked off a 2.5-century system of chattel slavery.
You have to realize these earliest American conflicts weren't just random skirmishes. They were fundamentally competing interests colliding head-on. On one side, you have European colonial powers, intensely driven by a hunger for land, wealth, and freedom. And on the other, established Native American tribes fighting to defend their ancestral lands, their societies, and their inherent sovereignty. That friction totally defined the early colonial era.
Chapter 2. The Road to Revolution, Unrest in the Colonies. Fast forward to the mid-18th century. The colonies are booming, they're populated, and they are incredibly lucrative. But the British Empire had been fighting some very expensive global wars, and naturally, that brought heavy taxes to American shores, which, as we know, sparked some fierce resistance.
It really is fascinating to watch this escalate step by step. The frustration over taxation without representation didn't turn into a war overnight. It starts with the Stamp Act in 1765, hitting everyday paper goods. That economic anger boils over into tragic street violence with the Boston Massacre in 1770. Then it becomes organized protest with the Tea Party, until finally it's direct armed rebellion with the shot heard round the world at Lexington in 1775.
And then comes 1776. The crucial takeaway here is that the Declaration of Independence literally transformed what was just a tax rebellion into a full-fledged revolution for human rights and political independence. The colonists weren't just asking for better treatment anymore. They were declaring themselves a totally sovereign people. And honestly, those specific words still serve as the bedrock for civil rights debates to this day.
Chapter 3. Forging a New Nation, Building a Government. Okay, so winning the grueling Revolutionary War against the British Empire, that was just step 1. The newly independent states then faced the monumental task of actually governing themselves without falling apart, and they quickly found out that overthrowing a king is sometimes a lot easier than building a functioning government.
Their first attempt was the Articles of Confederation, and well, it had a very weak central government. It couldn't even collect taxes or settle border disputes between states. Once it failed to handle domestic crises like Shays' Rebellion, the founders basically had to go back to the drawing board in Philadelphia. Born out of intense debate and some very heavy compromises, they drafted an entirely new constitution that prioritized a stronger but carefully balanced central government.
To ensure no single entity gained the tyrannical power of a king, they ingeniously chopped federal authority into 3 distinct pieces: the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. That system of checks and balances, that is exactly why you still see deliberate political gridlock in the government today. It was literally designed to work that way.
This political divide has echoed through absolutely every era of American history. You had the Federalists going all in on this new Constitution and federal power, and on the flip side, the Anti-Federalists, who deeply feared federal overreach and championed state sovereignty. This tug-of-war between federal authority and state power is just baked right into the nation's DNA.
Chapter 4. Manifest Destiny and Expansion, Looking West. So the new government has found its footing. By the early 19th century, the U.S. had survived the War of 1812, secured its independence on the world stage, and immediately turned its hungry eyes toward the vast, untamed West.
This westward push was fueled by a cultural phenomenon called manifest destiny.
It was this powerful ideology justifying aggressive territorial acquisitions, because Americans believed they were divinely ordained to stretch from sea to shining sea. But as we know, this belief system came with a staggering, devastating human cost for the Native Americans and Mexicans who were already living on that land.
60,000. I want you to really think about that number. That is how many Native Americans were forcibly displaced by the Indian Removal Act of 1830, pushed by President Andrew Jackson. This forced relocation led directly to the horrific Trail of Tears, where roughly 15,000 people died from disease, starvation, and exposure as they were pushed west of the Mississippi.
Tracking this rapid expansion, we can clearly see how the endless quest for land just ignited conflict after conflict, from securing borders in the War of 1812, straight into the Texas Revolution at the Alamo in 1836, and right into the Mexican-American War in 1846, which handed the U.S. massive new territories. And then, practically the moment the dust settled in 1848, the California gold rush began, dragging hundreds of thousands of people to the Pacific coast. To truly wrap your head around the economic explosion of this era, check this out. The California gold rush produced an estimated $550 million worth of gold by the 1850s. In today's money, that's a staggering $187 billion. That kind of sudden wealth radically transformed the global economy and permanently cemented America's presence in the West.
Chapter 5. A House Divided. The Civil War. All of this newly acquired land brought an unavoidable crisis right to the forefront. As the nation expanded, the explosive question of whether these new Western territories would actually permit slavery threatened to tear the United States apart completely.
So I want you to consider a critical question here. The U.S. government had spent decades, literally decades, drafting these highly delicate legislative deals just to maintain an exact balance of power between free and slave states in Congress. But what happens when those Band-Aid solutions finally unravel?
While the escalation was terrifying, we start with uneasy deals like the 1820 Missouri Compromise, but by 1854, letting territories vote on slavery resulted in outright violence in Bleeding Kansas. That radicalized figures like John Brown, whose 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry pushed the nation right to the absolute brink. Finally, Lincoln is elected in 1860. Southern states secede, and the first shots are fired by the Confederacy at Fort Sumter in 1861.
What followed was 4 grueling years of total war. Major cities like Atlanta were burned straight to the ground. Ultimately, the Union was preserved, and the horrific institution of chattel slavery was abolished once and for all. But it came at the unimaginable cost of 600,000 American lives. It remains the bloodiest conflict in the nation's history.
Chapter 6. Reconstruction and the West. A new era. In the wake of the Civil War and Lincoln's tragic assassination, this deeply bruised nation entered the Reconstruction era. They were suddenly facing this massive dual challenge, rebuilding a devastated South and guaranteeing civil rights for newly freed Black Americans, all while simultaneously expanding their industrial reach across the Western frontier.
During this window, 2 major national projects were running at the exact same time. On one hand, you have profound constitutional triumphs, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments fundamentally expanding human rights and citizenship. On the other hand, in 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad is completed, suddenly connecting the coasts, cutting a months-long journey down to just a week, and supercharging Western settlement.
But, tragically, the immense promise of this era was cut short. Early on in Reconstruction, federal troops were actually used to enforce civil rights and suppress white supremacist groups like the KKK. However, the political compromise of 1877, which was drafted to settle a contested presidential election, ended all of that. Federal troops were withdrawn, abandoning those monumental civil rights efforts, which led directly to unchecked disenfranchisement, segregation, and the Jim Crow era. It's a stark reminder of how quickly the pendulum swings back when the federal government withdraws its protections.
As we wrap up, it's clear the history of this nation is an incredibly complex tapestry of high ambition and violent friction. Every single era is marked by choices that completely reshape the future. It really leaves us to wonder, how will the political and social compromises we're making today be viewed by the historians of tomorrow? Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and I'll catch you in the next one.